At the age of very young, Eiichiro Oda deduced that he would become a mangaka because he didn't want to get a quote real job, as even at this very young age, Eiichiro Oda saw the disconnect between passion and profession, and he has since used that to create the Marines, the most enduring antagonistic force of One Piece and a metaphor of Japanese society itself, particularly with office culture, with the 3 pre-time skip admirals representing the 3 outcomes of being trapped within this culture, along with Luffy standing against all 3 as a symbol of freedom from it. To begin, in Japan there is a proverb that goes, Deru kugi wa utareru, which means the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, which is true of all societies to varying degrees, but Japan is particularly unenthusiastic about individualism, and so social etiquette can often be viewed as quite similar to a military-style organization, particularly when it comes to the strict inability to question one's superiors. Hierarchy is paramount at all times, and it can be nigh on impossible to attain even a glimpse of the sort of freedom that characterizes a Monkey D. Luffy. For example, if you're with a group of people, there are strict rules of how, when, and where to sit. Higher-ranking individuals sit furthest from the door, I guess that would be over here in the case of my office, while slower-ranking individuals sit closer to it. And in an office scenario, this is a show of respect and a sign of willingness to handle incoming disruptions, which is why the Marines are such a wonderful metaphor, particularly of the office culture that Oda desperately wanted to avoid, so much so that he went as far as to create the best-selling manga series of all time just to avoid being stuck in one of these jobs. Although the impression of the Marines has evolved somewhat over time, the Marines are actually initially portrayed as more of a Yakuza-style organization, particularly the Admirals, who are all based on real-life actors primarily known for starring in old Yakuza movies. And there's a pretty clear distinction. They feel a lot more like a Yakuza force pre-time skip, which is when it feels to us like the Marines are the absolute ceiling of what we know in the world. They're the ones in charge, they have the powers and the authorities to do whatever they want, or so we thought. However, post-time skip, you realize just how powerless even the Marine Admirals are in the grand scheme of things, and the corporate culture metaphor becomes much stronger and takes over the previous Yakuza one, with each of our 3 original Admirals having admitted how trapped they are at one point or another, and with all 3 coming up with their own tragic solutions to solve this problem. Even the standout examples of success, such as current Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. At first glance, our Magma boy is the ideal salaryman. He has the utmost of loyalty to the company, and he dedicates all of his energy to its prosperity because he truly believes in its purpose. He's the kind of worker who doesn't just rock up for the paycheck. Sakazuki is doing this because he believes on an almost religious level that he is changing the world for the better. And so Sakazuki's choice was to pursue hierarchy to its pinnacle, to obey all of the rules in the hopes of one day becoming the rule maker, because even an obedient red dog like Sakazuki doesn't believe that the system is anywhere near perfect. In his case, he believes that it is far too lenient on criminals and assorted ne'er-do-wells, including even innocent children of said ne'er-do-wells who are not innocent to Sakazuki. If you have the blood of a criminal, you are going to become a criminal. That is the Sakazuki philosophy. And so he's dedicated his life to reaching the position of Fleet Admiral, only to realize just how powerless this position really is. During his first post-time skip appearance in chapter 700, the long-awaited Sakazuki is shown to be in a meeting, reading reports and delegating tasks. And you might say, but man, on the internet, meetings, reports, and delegating tasks, that is exactly what a boss man does. And I would say yes, but that is not why Sakazuki wanted the job. He wanted to become Fleet Admiral because he thought this role would allow him to take a more active role, to give him more agency, and to have the freedom to move the Marines under his ideological directive. He was wrong, so very wrong, and he has instead found himself trapped in a maze of paperwork and bureaucracy, unable to move. And almost every subsequent appearance of Sakazuki has featured this man stuck in his office dealing with resource management and not making any progress whatsoever towards his personal goals. And here is a statistic that I love. Sakazuki has appeared in 4 One Piece movie films, and in each film he is stuck in his office. It's all non-canon, but it is such a perfect metaphor. Whenever these huge series events are happening, Sakazuki can't even show up because he's too busy at work. But his second post-time skip appearance is in chapter 793, when Sakazuki visits the 5 elders to figure out just what the crap was going on with that Doflamingo man on Dressrosa. And this scene, it is beautifully soul-crushing because it consists of the 5 elders chastising Sakazuki, treating him like a child, telling him not to talk back, and making it clear that the Marines are just a quote, outward face of the world government. Alright, POV, you are Sakazuki. When you were a Marine Admiral, you only had one boss to answer to, who was Fleet Admiral Sengoku. But now that you've gotten your promotion to Fleet Admiral, you don't just have one boss anymore, you've got 5 bosses you need to answer to, as well as 1 secret boss. In essence, Sakazuki achieved the impossible goal of becoming CEO of the Marines, but the CEO still has to answer to the board, in addition to the shareholders, which in this case would be the world nobles, which is why one of the most singular, powersome men on the planet ends up being berated by a guy complaining that he wasn't able to eat some lobster one time. And it's only now, once he's fallen into this trap, that Sakazuki realized that the higher up you go within the Marines, the less freedom you have. And look, I don't want to use the word slave too lightly because a lot of that does actually happen in One Piece, but Sakazuki is essentially a glorified slave of the world nobles at this point, which is something that Monkey D. Garp realized much earlier on in his career, and why he refused any promotion beyond the rank of Vice Admiral, which had already trapped him in the system thoroughly enough. In fact, in the case of both Garp and Sengoku, they cannot leave the Marines. They both retired after the Paramount War, but the world government would not let them go. They're still within the organization, but they're both performing different roles now. However, the sad thing is, neither of them will ever be free. They'll both be serving this organization till the day they die. And just look at Kong for a good example of this. That dude retired from being Fleet Admiral only to be installed as Commander-in-Chief. It's like every time you want to retire, you just keep being promoted into higher and higher positions with less and less freedom. And the Marines in general, they're like quicksand in the 90s, absolutely everywhere, and the harder you try to escape, the more it is they keep you trapped. And bear in mind that this is the good outcome. This is what happens when you do everything right, obey all of the rules, and perform as expected. So now let's explore what happens when you don't meet that impossibly high standard. The greatest prize to be won on God Valley may have been Shaki, but the greatest prize to be won in this video is the award-winning flavor from the sponsor of this video, Fume. And this here special device, this is a Fume Zero. A single-use flavored air device with no vapor, no nicotine, and no batteries, just magnificent flavored air in a brand new super sleek package, made for relieving daily stresses, featuring all new fidgeting technologies with a satisfying chewable mouthpiece. Om nom nom. And what I love about Fume Zero is that it makes life simple. There's no opening it up to change the flavor cores. It is just a one and done, straight out of the package, ready to go, no setup, which I really appreciate. I prefer to streamline my life wherever possible, and it is especially important when trying to form new habits. And Fume Zero comes in fantastic flavors such as crispy mint, peach blush, raspberry, mango, orange, vanilla, and spearmint ice, with each Fume Zero delivering 10 days straight of peak flavor. With Fume already having helped over 500,000 Fumans develop better habits, and Zero has just made it easier than ever to start. So you can and should check out Fume by using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen, because there are now 0 barriers to better habits. And thank you so much as always to Fume, as it's due to the support of sponsors like them that we're able to bring you the best fictional pirate content possible as often as possible. So definitely check them out, but for now it's back to you, me. As on the other end of this spectrum is Mr. Kuzan, the practitioner of lazy justice, which is one of the harder philosophies to understand because it can be difficult to see how it applies in a military context like the Marines. However, lazy justice makes infinitely more sense when you consider it as part of the company culture metaphor, because I'm sure most of you will have seen something like this. But every year there's a new article that comes out on the internet reporting that surveys in Japan suggest that half of all companies employ a quote old guy who does nothing. And that is originally what Kuzan was. There are reportedly old dudes in companies who have chosen a life of laziness, and their daily activities tend to consist of taking breaks, idle chit-chatter, and my personal favorite, staring off into space. Apparently Japanese companies are plagued with these men, and when I say old guys, Kuzan was 47 years old when we first met him, so he is definitely heading up there at this point. And the reason why this is a phenomenon, it's multifaceted, but it can broadly boil down to a loss of purpose. The idea is that you've been part of this system for so long that it's just worn you down over time. And in the case of Kuzan, prior to adopting lazy justice, his motto was actually surprisingly burning justice. Kuzan was a thoroughly driven man with willpower on the same level as Sakazuki. However, over his time with the Marines, Kuzan lost that fire. He stopped believing in his purpose, and he settled into the rather comfortable place of lazy justice, which, to clarify, is is defined as the belief that justice is seldom worth pursuing and should be enforced with as minimal effort as possible. And it's very interesting to go back on pre-time skip Kuzan because a lot of his comical quirks are quite sad in retrospect. The first time we meet Kuzan in chapter 303, our introduction to him was the five elders complaining about Kuzan going sightseeing and not taking his rank seriously. And given that part of his character design is a sleeping mask, I would honestly have to agree with them. After reaching Long Ring Long Land, instead of doing his job, Kuzan makes idle chit-chat with Nami. And even the fact that Kuzan slowly rides a bicycle across the sea is making a mockery of the concept of efficiency. And Kuzan is even so lazy that 30 seconds after meeting the Straw Hats, he decides that he needs to take a break from his break and needs to have a lie down. After which point he attempts to do some maths, adding up the bounties of the crew before promptly abandoning that task because it is too much effort. All of which is hilarious when we first meet him. He's not at all what you'd expect a Marine Admiral to be after meeting characters like Smoker, but that's because we've met a man who's already more or less abandoned justice. It is seldom worth pursuing. And the exact point at which this happened was identified by Oda as the Ohara incident, which is what turned Kuzan away from Garp's philosophy and left him in a place of nihilism that he still somewhat occupies today. The key thing with Kuzan, though, is that he has not completely given up. The system has eroded 99% of his beliefs, but there was still something to hang on to. And ultimately, Kuzan would use that remaining 1% of passion to fight for the position of Fleet Admiral and to subsequently resign from the Marines when he was unsuccessful. After which point, he would go on to join Mr. Blackbeard. And the exact reason why Kuzan joined Blackbeard, it's a bit of a mystery at the time of this recording. I say a bit because it doesn't really matter as we already understand the core principle behind it. Kuzan joined Blackbeard because Teach was honest with him. He said that he and his crew, they weren't necessarily the best of friends and that they were a group of free people working together with an aligned interest. And his offer to Kuzan was, "You're a free man. What do you want, Kuzan?" Those words may have been said by what looks to be the ultimate antagonist of the series, but Blackbeard actually says quite a lot of wise words. And these words in particular are what Oda wanted to hear as a child. Not that you need to do this and that, but that you have the freedom to decide what you want to do. That is what piracy represents to Oda, to Luffy, and apparently to Blackbeard. And meanwhile, this is directly contrasted against the world government when Mr. St. Topman Warcurie is particularly upset about Kuzan joining Blackbeard, and he says, "And what of Kuzan then? He's dedicated his considerable power to assisting Blackbeard, of all people. A fine message that sends about the Marines, Which I love because Warcurie is less concerned with the individual betrayal and more concerned about how it reflects upon the collective. He is concerned with the image, remembering that earlier the five elders had described the Marines as the image of the world government. And if there's one thing that we can say for sure that Blackbeard has never been concerned with, it is his image. And that's why compared to the Marines, even Blackbeard looks like a warrior of liberation. So Kuzan, I think, had a rather happy ending, but it didn't come without cost. Kuzan's fight against Sakazuki for the Fleet Admiral position took a huge physical toll, leaving scars all over his body and even claiming one of his legs, which is a great allegory of what this lifestyle can cost you. You go to work every day in a very nice suit, hopefully, and nothing looks wrong, but over time, these scars build up and can leave you as quite the broken man. And speaking of broken men, Kizaru, mate, this is Oda's magnum opus for this metaphor. When former Fleet Admiral Sengoku retired, there is a reason why he recommended Kuzan and the world nobles recommended Sakazuki, with nobody at any stage thinking that Kizaru should have become the next Fleet Admiral, especially not Kizaru himself. In fact, during his call with Sentomaru right before the invasion of Egghead Island, Kizaru refers to himself as, quote, "just another cog in the machine," which is already pretty bad. The dude's made it all the way to the rank of Admiral, and he still doesn't see himself as anything but a device to be used by the collective. However, it's actually much worse than that. In Japanese, the term that Kizaru originally used is shachiku, which can be directly translated as wage slave. It's a combination of the kanji used to form the words company and livestock, and it's said to have been conceived by the chairman of the Japan Supermarket Association, going on to mean an employee who is completely subservient to their company, never complaining about overwork or any other issues. That is what Kizaru describes himself as, because he is the worst case outcome. His will has been completely broken. Kizaru's motto is unclear justice because he himself has no vision for the future, nor does he dare to take a moral position on what actually constitutes constitutes justice. It's dangerously close to the point where Kizaru has lost all sense of self and has now been perfectly mechanically integrated, as so many salarymen find themselves becoming. And even the One Piece Vivia Card data book is pretty rough on Kizaru, describing him as not much of a leader, and despite his rank, he prefers to follow orders. Not only is he just a cog in the machine, but he's also a rather rusty cog. Kizaru is extremely inept with any technology, and his subordinates constantly need to re-explain how to use the same devices like the Black Denden Mushi. Kizaru is a broken, withered salaryman, and the exact opposite of what Oda wanted to become, which may also be why Kizaru proved to be the greatest challenge for the Straw Hats, appearing on Sabati Archipelago to give these young dreamers a wake-up call and to show them the overwhelming pressure of the world around them. These three admirals show the three paths forward if you choose to integrate, and none of them are satisfied with the lives that they've led as a result of their choices. In fact, the only Marine who seems to have found some meaning within the organization is arguably Garp, and I think that may be because Oda's father, Setsuro Oda, was a salaryman who also enjoyed painting as a hobby. In fact, Oda has one of his father's paintings proudly hanging in his house, showcasing vibrant primary colors that would go on to become a staple scheme for the colors of One Piece. But the whole relationship between Garp and Luffy definitely feels like it comes from somewhere. I mean, I'm assuming that Setsuro Oda was probably kind enough to not throw his son into a jungle to force him to survive, but that feeling of pressure from Garp to Luffy to become a great Marine, that seems like it could spawn from parental pressure to become part of this established society. In Japanese, there is a concept known as gamen. It's a form of Japanese stoicism that encourages people to persevere and endure, with the term roughly meaning enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity, which is very much how I would describe Garp. I'm sure he's not proud of everything that he's done as a Marine, definitely not, but he endures it because of what he has managed to accomplish for the world, as well as for the D factor. Think back to the proverb, the one about the nail sticking out that gets hammered down. This is what Garp has in his mind when raising Dragon, Luffy, and Ace to become Marines. He knew that these three misfits were already pretty noticeable nails due to the fact that they are all members of the D clan, and it's even been stated by Sengoku that Garp likely would have been executed long ago if not for his hero status within the Marines. So he was doing his best to keep his family alive. He was trying to hammer in those nails very tightly before the much more brutal hammer of the world government stumbled across them. But in the end, I believe that Luffy is an ideal vision of Oda who refuses conformity at every opportunity. Whenever an idea is brought to him by a group, like say the Straw Hat Grand Fleet pledging their allegiance to him, Luffy immediately takes a left turn. And he was unlikely to know this at the time, but Eiichiro Oda, and by extension his character of Luffy, share a similar philosophy to 20th century author Natsume Soseki. To him, there was a disconnect between Japanese society and the ability to create art, as Natsume Soseki believed that art must be an individual expression. Japanese critics of Natsume Soseki have labeled him as egocentric. However, almost everyone in Japan would go on to admit that Natsume Soseki was on the money, as he quite literally is on a 1,000 yen bill. But this emphasis on individual expression is how Oda writes Luffy, and a big part of why Luffy resonates so strongly with not just his target audience of Japanese teenage boys, but everyone around the world who struggle to various degrees with the rules and expectations of their respective societies. And it's also why the Marines feel like such a rich group of antagonists. So many times in shonen manga, an author sets up a group of villains who are just sort of there to aura farm and not to actually explore any ideas. But what I love about the Marines is that the people within this institution, whether they are written as villains or not, are all tragic victims of this system in their own ways. And they've all got their own individual opinions on this system that can often even clash with one another. But after successfully breaking out of this system, in the one known interview with Oda's father, Setsuro Oda, he had this to say about his son's work. The most important thing is everyone is happy. I hope One Piece spreads its wings across the world. And thank you so much again to Fume for sponsoring this video, and definitely check them out through the link in the description.